Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to present to you and introduce you to a gentleman that has taken a great interest in this nation and the things of the past, and in helping preserve them and to keep the truth of the natural order of things. He has certainly won my great respect, and it gives me pleasure at this time to introduce to you Dr. Robert Alrutz, a professor that is well qualified because of his personal interest above all in the things of this nation. I'm just going to let him take over at this moment and describe to you this beautiful, magnificent place that we're standing here now. Doctor?
Thank you very much. We're standing here at the entrance to the Great Circle Mound of the Newark Earthworks in Licking County, Ohio. In the background you can see some of the earthworks, and we stopped here briefly at the model to point out that the earthworks actually encompassed an extensive series of structures in bygone days, of which only this area here, the Great Circle Mound, and this area over here, the Octagon Mound, are still in existence. The significance of these is that these are perhaps the greatest earthworks in the world of the mound builder period, which was somewhere around the beginning of the Christian era. In the background, we will take you up so that you can see the mound and get a better view of it than you can with that truck in our background. Thank you. Okay, we're standing now up on the embankment of Great Circle Mound, right near it. In fact, this area here is called one of the gateways to it. You can look across over there. You can see where the man is walking with his little dog. You can see the ditch from which they dug the dirt and piled it up. And this was probably done by baskets, from what evidences we can find in some of these mounds. Once in a while you'll find a basket as if somebody said, "I've had enough," and walked off and left it there. But one can imagine, as you panoramic around to your left, all the way around, this is about, they tell me, about 1 mile around. You'll have a little difficulty seeing it through the trees as the distance down through there, but it'll give you a feel of the immense nature of this place. And isn't it something? Can you imagine what this must have been used for? Just think about it. What Hollywood could do with it, for instance. Can't you just see at night a parade of people going around this area with torches glowing? This undoubtedly had some religious significance to the people, because why else would they have put all the work into this and built such a magnificent structure? But remember, this is only part, a very small remnant left of what was once the great Newark Earthworks. This was not used for burial. This is ceremonial. Whether there are any burial associated with it, none have ever been found. In the center back there, you can see a bit of a rise, so-called bird mound, eagle mound. That has been excavated in part, and nothing was found within it, so it's not a burial mound. In the model of the mounds. We have been up right on this knob right here, which is part of the gateway, and had attempted to photograph the eagle mound here in the center. As I mentioned, this is approximately 1 mile around. The other mound which we have is over here. This is the octagon mound, as you can see by its shape, with an associated circle mound with it, and a series of structures indicated here, which at the time of the discovery of the Keystone were called caches, or burial pits. And it was in one of these, this one, possibly this one here, that David Wyrick, together with his son, opened up the whole question of the Newark Holy Stones, because it was there that they uncovered the yellow keystone containing Hebrew characters on its four sides. All of the rest of this has been demolished by building by people, except the octagon and circle, which are currently the Mound Builder Golf Course. This is the sort of the City of Newark Country Club. The land is leased by the Historical Society to the Country Club and is used for a golf course. We'll attempt to show you at least where that is located later. At the octagon, this is the overall view of the octagon mound. We were over here at Great Circle Mound. And as I pointed out earlier, it is probably about in here, in one of these actually pits here, that the Keystone was found by David Wyrick. If we simply move to the other part of the sign here, we can see a graph, a timetable, so to speak, with this be the beginning of the Christian era right here. The Adena period, Adena and Hopewell period, is this era right along in here when all of these mounds were built. Obviously, you can see that there were people here prior to that. These are the Paleo and the Archaic and the so-called Glacial Came. These are people who built in glacial mounds that were deposited. But the period we're interested in is about 1000 BC to 700 AD. We really don't have definitiveness. Actually, this area in which we are was apparently not a great village site. We're having trouble finding anything in the way of remains of towns and so on. There's a few. We're just getting started on that. But this is the famous earthwork site.
And bless your hearts, as you notice by that chart, we're talking about 100 to 200 BC that these events transpired. You're now looking at a part of the site or part of the hex to the tomb itself. And how fantastic. We see a modern day golf course here that keeps it up. Modern day in complementing, if you would, that has been 1 to 200 years BC. Now, I want to show you, if I may, part of the reason that caught our interest in this area. At the same time, I would like to give you my opinion, call it an authority, if you like, but it is supplementation or supplication to what we have learned, what has been said, and I'd like to give you my opinion. From our Father's Word, we have an advantage in many cases, though some might disagree, be that as it may. But being familiar with our Father's Word, we are able to recognize many things that are utilized in the symbology. So I want to go back to the very first mound, or part of the mound that we visited. I want to go to this area that is called the Big Circle, the Huge Circle. Within it, we have 30 acres. Now, it's important that you remember that. You'll remember, as the good doctor told us, this is called the eagle. These two objects in the center of this huge 30-acre circle. Now, whether they call them the eagle, and I'm sure if there is ever a dig at this place, it will document what I'm saying. These two are symbolic of the egg and the sperm. That is to say, the seed of man and the egg of woman, and this is a womb. I wish you to note that the opening is very near the opening of a cervix. And then from this, it enters a birth canal from the womb. Understand, this opens directly into the spring equinox, which is a sign of fertility. Now, these things don't happen by accident, dear one. Someone was a teacher. I feel they used this method of teaching to teach life itself. Let's follow that life as we leave the womb through the cervix. Now this is 1 mile across an actual area. Think of the number of people and the beauty, if you would, in which it is placed in its position. From the cervix into the birth canal, and then square is always the earth, north, east, south, and those things that represent the peoples of the earth. And then from the earth you enter into the circle of life, the great, great circle of life, flowing with the opening of the spring equinox. And many times sickness will befall one, and we see this road that almost heads for what is the tomb. Here, almost to that road that heads for the tomb, but whether it be by accident or sickness, we return again to that great circle of life. But inasmuch as all must at one time or the other that inhabit this earth, we do make that great trip to the tomb. Now this is the pyramid, if you would, of stone, which unfortunately not available any longer because 15,000 wagon loads of stones were hauled from this spot. You will notice also that there are 30 acres within this circle. As there were 30 acres in the womb that gave birth, then that holds 30 acres die. I'm using that, you could use a number, but be that as it may, I'll give you a number in a moment. But now, this is one of the tombs in which the Holy Stone was found. The leaders were buried in this general area. It was here that our gentleman discovered the Holy Stone. But with this being the tomb and of death, now hold on to your hats. It enters into another womb. This womb does not have an opening as a cervix, but a bridge. The bridge to life, or that is to say the womb of eternal life. That life after death, drawn out in symbology whereby through the ritual, once each year, they gathered from hundreds of miles at this great area and went through this celebration of life itself, yes, even into the eternity. Now, one thing that adds a great deal of authenticity to the fact that it is the Holy Stone, you will remember, and I want to switch back to the chart one more time if I may. You that are scholars, listen closely. 30 acres in this circle, 30 acres in the tomb, which is to say, all that are born in flesh die in flesh. But only 2/3, this circle, this eternal womb is only 20 acres, meaning we lost 1/3 from here to here. How fascinating, inasmuch as this work by carbon test and other methods that we have 100 to 200 BC. How precious. 100 to 200 BC. You understand what I'm saying? That's before Christ. That is before Christ. Someone knew. Who was this someone? Well, we will find out from the Holy Stone itself. We can tell a great deal about this individual, a great deal that he brought to pass as he used this method of teaching, which is not uncommon. Certainly, someone would have to be familiar with the book of Jeremiah. Someone would have to be familiar with the book of Zechariah and many of the writings to understand that third that fell in the world that was, as well as the third. Remember the barbers cut the hair 1/3, 2/3, and then the third that is literally destroyed, as well as the little remnant. That little remnant always teaches, dear one. It is God's plan and it is His purpose. This is my opinion of the mounds at Newark in Ohio and how precious they are. At this time, I want you to hear the story of a great man, I feel, a man that perhaps was not respected in his community and was doubted a great deal. If this document accomplishes any one thing other than teaching you concerning America before Christ, I hope that we can do it as a monument to this man that spent so much of his life, which brought nothing but sorrow, as he tried to teach these things and show the authenticity of the mound people of Newark, Ohio, that we can honor him in doing that and certainly thank him for that he has presented for us. Now, bless your hearts, I want you to hear the story from Dr. Arnold about this particular man. I think you'll enjoy it. I think it'll fascinate you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, again, it gives me great pleasure to be here with this gentleman that I have found certainly to be an interesting person simply in his thoughts and in the preservation, in his background knowledge of this area as well as many other areas. And I just want him to take the liberty to share some of his thoughts and in the discoveries that he has made in following this thought through. So again, it gives me great pleasure to present to you Dr. Robert Alrutz.
Thank you. I gather if you were with us here now, you would see that I am not an archaeologist. I am a biologist, a field biologist. I got into this subject doing some research as an ecologist on a local site here in Licking County, Ohio. And one of the ways of doing that is you go back and study the history of the place as best you can. And in doing so, I kept running into some references to some finds related to the mound builders of Licking County, to references to some things called holy stones. And as I kept reading these in different books and writings, I kept finding confusing points. I wasn't sure what they were talking about. And at one of my meetings with some local people, somebody said to me, "Did you know that those stones are at Keystone, Ohio, in the museum?" No, I didn't. So I said to my wife one summer day, "Let's go off up to Keystone, take a trip, and we'll find those stones. I'll take some pictures of them." And in the process of doing that, the curator at the museum said, "Would you like to see the folder about the stones?" I said, "Well, sure, why not?" Lo and behold, I got hooked. Wow. Because in the folder were 17 letters written in the 1860s to people associated with this find. And that sort of hooked me. I said to my wife on the way home, "I'm going to knock off being a biologist for 1 year and become a historian and do a history of the finds of the Newark holy stones." Now, of course, as everything else, you never guess the time right. It took me 5 years. But in the process, it turned out to be a very fascinating thing. This goes back to the period of 1860, when, of course, this was close to being colonial countryside at that time. And there was a character, I don't know what else to call him, by the name of David Wyrick, who lived in Newark, Ohio. He had come there about 20 years previously, after having been the publisher of a newspaper about 80 miles from here, and he backed the wrong political party and went broke, and he moved up here. I think he may have had some relatives. He had actually had come from here in this area originally, and he was noted for being a mathematical genius, which of course at that time meant he could do surveying. And he became the county surveyor, which he pursued for a number of years, and in the process of being the surveyor, had the hobby as many of the people of this area had, and that was digging. Today they would call them potato diggers. He was going out to see what they could find. And he was a little bit better than the most, because actually he corresponded with the Smithsonian Institute and sent some materials to them. But David had some problems, one of which was, I think we can safely diagnose him, he had rheumatoid arthritis, because he was described as having feet he could hardly walk on and hands that didn't look like they could be used for anything. Except he was really quite a skilled artist. It's surprising what he could do. And one of the original maps of the mound builder area was done by David Wyrick, as is published in the local atlas. But David had a funny theory. David felt that the mound builders were the lost tribes of Israel. Now, he was not alone in that. A lot of people of that period had that thesis. But it had changed, and people began to realize that this wasn't true, that the Indians had come across the Bering Strait, and on and on and on. But David was quite adamant about this, apparently, because he had a local reputation for it. But he must have been a local character with his crippled nature and his digging and so on. But was it about the 30th of June in 1860? He and his son were in McCrory's Woods over near that octagon mound, and they were digging, as David liked to dig, and he came upon a thing has become to call the Keystone. Of course, it was encased in clay when he dug it up, and he spit on it and wiped it off. And his son said, as soon as he saw those characters, he ran off to Newark like a crazy man. And it so happened that that day, in Newark at that day, visiting the mayor, who was an archaeologist also, as an archaeologist one of the period, also Ohio's kind of premier archaeologist, Charles Whittlesey, Dr. Charles Whittlesey, Colonel Charles Whittlesey from Cleveland. Interestingly enough, he was visiting the mayor because they were in a business together, making kerosene out of coal. The coal oil business, you know? We've kind of forgotten how to do that. But word got to them about David's find, and they got a hold of David and put him in their wagon. They went back to the site, and they confirmed that this had been dug out of there. They went back to Newark, and this caused a lot of excitement because they got a hold of the local Episcopal priest, a young man who was educated up at Kenyon, and he translated these as having Jewish sayings down the sides. And so happened in town at that time, there was a reporter from the Cincinnati Enquirer. Now, Cincinnati, you need to note, was the Queen City of the Midwest. This was the seat of culture, the only culture outside New York City, in the minds of people in New York. But he wrote up quite an article about this, and that got a lot of attention. And in fact, he later invited David to come to Cincinnati to show this Holy Stone, as it came to be called, to the authorities in Cincinnati. Unfortunately, the reporter was out of town when David got there, and thus he had no local support. And the local authorities, one was David Wise, the founder of Reformed Judaism in America. He examined it, snorted, that's modern characters. The other one was a sculptor by the name of Jones, famous in Ohio because he sculptured the bust of Lincoln that stands in our Capitol building. And he looked at it, he called it a Dornick, which is a slang term for a fake type of thing. Jones happens to be buried right outside of Granville here. So David didn't do very well. He didn't even get any money, and he lamented when he got home he spent the only $19 he had for the trip. But he did run into, I think, he ran into a archaeologist by the name of Dr. Unzicker, because Dr. Unzicker visited him later that summer, I'm quite convinced. And they went out south of Newark, south of the Great Circle Mound, to a place called the Great Stone Mound. Now, this was a pile of rocks up on the top of a hill near the National Pike. That was the Cumberland Road from Cumberland, Maryland to Springfield, Illinois, the first turnpike in America. Yeah. And it was right near that. And this is actually how I got into this stone business, because over at Buckeye Lake, a reservoir for the canal system, they discovered they needed rocks to rip-rap the dike. Somebody remember the Great Stone Mound? They hauled from there between 10 and 15,000 wagon loads of stone. That's cubic yards of stone. And in the process removed the only large stone mound known in America. But in the process they uncovered some earthen mounds that were underneath the Great Stone Mound. Unzicker and David Wyrick went there and investigated, discovered that about 10 years previously, the local farmers had dug a mound, and in it had found a coffin, a wooden, hollowed out of a log, containing a skeleton. Now, why they didn't do more, I don't know. But when David got there, they removed the lid off the coffin, and he wrote about what the skeleton looked like. And there was cloth with it, there was still hair, and there were copper rings as bracelets and so on. And he brought the coffin lid back to Newark. But his reputation was such by then that the local kids beset upon him and tried to get the lid away from him. They wanted to chop it up and make souvenirs out of it. Interestingly enough, a souvenir was made of it later, the gavel for the president of the Historical Society. How I'd love to find that gavel for radiocarbon dating. But anyway, in November, David and a local party went back to the Great Stone Mound to get underneath where the coffin had been. They discovered a clay basin. Now, one of the members of the party was a dentist, and he said the clay was fine enough to make dental impressions. And David was down in this hole digging, and he struck something, and he used his shovel to pry it up. And lo and behold, here was a carved stone box. And the dentist said he jumped out of the hole 12 feet, screaming, "Look what I found!" They decided, they examined it carefully. It was a box made of two parts. But they wouldn't open that till they got back to Newark, so everybody could see it. And one of the men says, "Well, look, there's a hole in the end." And he blew in the hole, and it fell open, and out came the Decalogue stone. This was a black stone. Now, this is a plaster cast of it, and it is painted black. It doesn't look quite like the stone because of the shine that this has. But they hurried back to Newark and got a hold of their Episcopal priest again, and lo and behold, here on the surface is a carved figure, masculine looking but with a dress, so people interpret it as being a priest, above whose head in Hebrew is the word Moses. And all over the surface of the stone are Hebrew characters on every surface, which have been translated now repeatedly, as the Ten Commandments. Not in perfect Hebrew, not without mistakes, and so on. Now, one of the interesting things this doesn't show, you'll notice there's a handle on the bottom. The handle was broken off in this delicately carved stone box. I don't have a model of the box, it costs too much. But the broken handle is interesting, because in the tradition of the mound builders, if you were burying something, it had to be dead. So you broke it to indicate its death. Was that true of this? We do not know. This stirred up another furor. In fact, David was by this time suffering, because by then he had heard about an article written in New York and published in Harper's Weekly declaring this stone an absolute fraud and David the perpetuator of the fraud. This is written by some reporter in New York who didn't know David, didn't know anything about it, but nothing out of the West could ever be good because it wasn't New York. So David wrote a little paper to try and refute this. And I think when he was in Cincinnati, he bought a Jewish Bible to try and do his own translation, because the story sort of disappears at this point. Now we're talking about the period of 1860. The letters that I found in the museum were replies to David from a man in New York who was the president of the Ethnological Society, putting David off, because David was bankrupt. There was no Social Security. He could no longer work. How was he going to live? And he was trying to sell the stones to the Ethnological Society or to anybody in New York. But this was the period of the uproar relative to the Civil War, and he couldn't find a buyer. We don't know what happened, but we do know that in 1864, on April the 15th, David, who had been taking laudanum, which was over-the-counter medicine, opium if you will, for his rheumatoid arthritis, David took an overdose of laudanum and committed suicide. That was also 2 days or 3 days after he had received notice of the sheriff's sale of his property. He was bankrupt. We don't really know what happened then. David was buried in a cemetery in Newark. But in 1867, the man who had somehow bought these stones, we don't know when or how, whether David sold them to him or whether it was part of his estate or what, who was a collector, bought them, came back to Newark and made a dig at the Great Stone Mound site in another mound and found yet another stone with possibly Hebrew on it. I have not had that translated. In addition, in 1865 there had been a dig, and 2 more stones were found east of Newark in a mound, one of which was about the size of a hen's egg, face, skull, head, across the forehead of which were Hebrew characters saying something about untimely death. It could be translated a number of ways. And the other one is a weird little stone about 3.5 inches, more or less triangular, containing an animal image with Hebrew characters, and also some characters that look perhaps like mound builder things, the arrow, the turkey track that you find in some of those carvings. Those have never been translated. I know of them only as photographs that the local photographer had made of them somewhere in 1865, and I stumbled upon these. So the story is an interesting one, you know. David was declared a fraud. In 1871, that Charles Whittlesey, the great colonel, wrote a paper saying it was a fraud. And the whole story went down as nothing but a fraud, and has been repeated as a fraud and amplified and changed ever since. I would simply say that David Wyrick did not fake these stones. David Wyrick could have. He had the skill. He carved woodcuts for his newspaper. I've seen those. And he didn't do this because he was such a meticulous workman. He would have copied the Bible and not made mistakes. And there are mistakes in the Hebrew here. It is not the same as in the Bible. What are they? Well, it so happens that coffin that David uncovered is an interesting coffin. I can find, I'm not an archaeologist now, I haven't read all the literature, but what I've read, I've seen no reference to coffins. The one place I find a reference to a coffin is, of all places, Swedish mound builders buried their people in oak coffins in a clay basin, like here, that held water, and the oak and the water prevented the corpses from rotting. They were so well preserved, the brains were still intact.
Wow.
Is perhaps this an amulet from somebody from Europe, some holy man whose remains were brought to Newark, Ohio, and placed in an oak coffin, as they did in Sweden? And why the stone mound? Well, Charles Squire, the great Ohio archaeologist who published the Smithsonian Institute, was working in New York, and he saw an Indian walking down the trail with a rock. And he walks over to a pile of stones, and he walks up on the pile and he drops it. And the investigator said, "Why did you do that?" And he said, "I don't know. That's a holy place, and you're supposed to put a stone there when you go by. So I put a stone there." You know, 3 coins in a fountain? We still do that sort of thing. And so happens the Great Stone Mound was near the great warrior trail, the Chieftain Trail, that went from northeastern Ohio down into Kentucky. I wonder, you know. I think these are amulets of holy people that were brought to this great worship site to be buried there, just as we would take people to St. Peter's in Rome or to Jerusalem to bury them there. I think Newark, Ohio at one time was a Jerusalem or a Mecca for religious purposes. And you brought people there for burial. Unfortunately, I fear that much of it has been destroyed, and we just don't know. But at least we got the holy stones. I got the record of them.
That is fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. We really appreciate this that you have accomplished.
It's all been simple, good library work.
Well,
and I encourage people to do it. It's fun. I know my wife said to me one day, you've got a detective story going there, haven't you? Because each little find would lead you to something else, And it is a fascinating story. And it's a fascinating story of people, too. Of poor old David Wyrick. I feel sorry for David. I'm going to take up a collection someday and put up a tombstone for him.
I think so. I think that would be wonderful. It's been a pleasure, and we really, Dr. Arnold, appreciate
You're very welcome.
The time you shared with us, and I know that coming by these facts, when you're marching the backwoods and so forth, putting it together, and yet I know one thing. I know you well enough in the visit we've had that's where you feel at home, that you enjoy that.
Well, I'm a scientist.
Yes.
That's what we do for a living.
All right, bless your hearts. Here we have the replica of that beautiful Keystone. That stone, rather the holy stone, that is to say, that stone with those Hebrew letters upon them, those letters that caused a man a great deal of problems in his life. Why? There was one rabbi that originally observed this from the beginning of Wyrick's interest in these beautiful mounds here at Newark. And he was an honest man. After that, I cannot speak that strongly or that kind to the rabbis that advised or gave opinions, for they simply, as you will discover in the footnotes to this, in Cincinnati, as this man was led there, lied about him. Outright, bald-faced lied. Why? They did not wish that the 10 tribes have recognition in this nation. Well, it's here, and there's nothing they can do about it. This documentary is done in memory, in part, for this one Wyrick that gave his life, you might as well say, researching this. Now, had there been a scholar available at the time, they could have documented readily, inasmuch as they found an old Hebrew Bible in Wyrick's home. You would not find the Aramaic, the Syriac, the Paleo-Hebrew, ancient alphabets in that Bible. Only the modern. Therefore, documenting the authenticity of this stone. And I wish to, if I may, draw attention to I'm going to use 2 letters that are not modern Hebrew, but are ancient rather, and would have saved this man's life, because it would have brought to him the respect that should have been born for him and to him through this great work of his in these mounds at Newark. One of the letters, I don't intend to go into the Hebrew to make it complicated, but I simply want to show you the case of 2 letters. One is an L. Now, had he taken this is our L. This is not modern Hebrew. This is Paleo-Hebrew, ancient Hebrew. That's why the first rabbi, in part, agreed that this was authentic. Because any man that has studied languages knows that a man that had no knowledge whatsoever of those languages could have picked up on Paleo-Hebrew, on Aramaic, Syriac, or Chaldee, whichever you wish to call it, even used by on Crete. Another letter I'm going to show you. This letter would be, in the English, our TS sound. It's called Tadi in the Hebrew tongue. The letter that we find on the Holy Stone is shaped thusly. Now, in other words, this is the way the letter is drawn on the holy stone. When were it to be in modern Hebrew, it would be like so, all right? This would be modern Hebrew. Now, David Deal, who has a paper on this particular works, he believes that in part, or at least I think he does, that it was Phalo Hebrew, which is to say, like so. Now, and I certainly respect his opinion. We can see or could account how in one's mind, if he used Phalo here, he had some working knowledge of it. That's to say, the person that chiseled or formed this stone. But I think our dating, as I stated, you can tell a great deal about a man, where his travels are, by the letters he uses. Now, if I may, and I wish for you to bear with me, I'm going to draw you this same letter. I'm going to do it in the Babylonian, with the Babylonian alphabet. It's very much like our common, very common M. Is the Babylonian or the Chaldee Sade. Now, in a man's travels, and bear in mind at 1 and 200 BC, they didn't carry around little pamphlets with the alphabet inscribed thereon. You would have to have carried the entire Bible in stone, and that would have been quite a load to pack. So you had to carry it up here. And in travels, things can become a little confused. I contend that this man, inasmuch as he knew Phalo, it started him remembering this V, but then no doubt coming from Crete or from the language where the Chaldee was used, which all of our people used it after the captivity of Babylon. No big deal, all right? Daniel has several chapters written in it. That's no big deal. I contend that the man remembered this Babylonian letter, or Chaldee, or Syriac, or Aramaic, whichever you wish to call it, it's all the same. And remembered it in his mind, confused it with the Phalo Zadi, and rather than making an M of this way, he simply drew the bar line as you would start in Phalo, and then took this V and inserted it on top. This is used 5 or 6 times on the stone, and the letter is consistent each time, documenting the fact. Now, a poor man like Wyrick, he could have done this? No way. No way. It is genuine, absolutely genuine. And this poor man was insulted by the people in, near, and around him for all those many years, when the find that he made is a find certainly that is precious. Number one, the story that is told by the huge womb, the birth of life into the flesh, the travels in the life circle itself as we travel, each of us, through this flesh age, that long passageway, much as the pyramid within the pyramid itself, that goes to the tomb, the old pyramid here in Newark, that has now been hauled away. Was this stone found in that area? And then this one that would take all that are born in the flesh, the 30-acre plot, into the 30-acre base, and then into a 20-acre eternal womb without a cervix, but yet a bridge into that life eternal. It took a Levite some knowledge. Each tribe was assigned their proportion of the Levitical priesthood. The Levitical priesthood, other than when they were in Jerusalem and in their own area of joining, were always attached to the other tribes. They did not, as you would say, have one large tribe that traveled as Levites. So Was he a Levite of Judah, or was he a Levite of the 10 tribes? It doesn't matter. It's obvious that it was a man of God that knew and understood the Scriptures. And he wrote, if you would, those 10 commandments on this stone because he honored our Father. And he used this great works to teach those 10 commandments to natives in this great nation. Could they have been natives even from gathering from all over the country on a waterway? That was a highway of that time. How interesting. I think we've only scratched the surface. Could they have come from the Yucatan Peninsula even in part, some of them, at an earlier time when a people disappeared? Well, a lot of work need be done and a lot of travel. I find it fascinating, and I find it the true definition and explanation of the great mounds. How I wish that Warwick himself could be living at this day and at this time to enjoy the knowledge that his sweat and his labor in digging day after day, and then being promised by certain people if he would bring the stone to a place, he borrows $25 to make a trip to Cincinnati. And what does he find in Cincinnati? Ridicule from a man with a poisoned tongue. And that $25 in, what was it, 1864, somewhere along in there, between the 64 and 70s, $25, my friend, was a great deal of money. It caused him to lose his property. So his quest for truth and his work brought him sadness. But may you, dear friend, at the price that was paid for it, enjoy the knowledge that we gain from this great works by a civilization before Christ. My dear friend, you are there.
The atlas drawing of the entrance to the mound with the eagle mound in the background back there. This is David Warwick's map of the Newark Earthworks. And this is Great Circle Mound here. This is the Octagon Mound, one we think is perhaps a moon observatory with a smaller circle associated with it. And I think right in here somewhere is where the Keystone was found. This is a signature of David Warwick. A survey of this section of record and so on and so forth. This is when he was the surveyor for Licking County. I don't know whether you want this or not, but you notice here this is a James M. McCrory Woods. This is where David found the Keystone, was in this area here. This map, you notice, does not show the mounds, because they didn't care about the mounds at that period of time. That was just something in the way. You know, they couldn't build as well because the mound was there. You had to flatten it off first. Again, David's map, and the arrow I have added based upon the manuscript of that map, which I found up at the Western Reserve Historical Society. So I think we're pretty certain as to where David found the Keystone. Does that help you any?
Great.
It's
And this is Keystone itself, right? Pictures you've taken.
can't hear you.
These are pictures you've taken?
Yeah, I took pictures of the stone. I copy things.
All right.
It doesn't show up very well there, but you can see some there.
Okay.
These are David's drawings of the Keystone, and translations of them here. The Holy of Holies is this phrase here, and the King of the Earth, this phrase here. And written above them in script is Hebrew. I've one of the translators. I'm not sure for sure which one of the translators. But these David had printed at the newspaper in Newark, Ohio, possibly from his own woodcuts, because I found originals of these broadsheets with printer's notes on them. And it makes me think that perhaps David had made woodcuts for that purpose. But this is David Wyrick's sketch of how the coffin lay in this clay basin which would hold water. In other words, water would come down through the mound and collect in there and not evaporate. It would just stay there. And then the oak preserved the body. It would not rot with because after all, we use oak, tannic acid in oak to tan leather. It makes a good preservative. And it was underneath the head of that they found the Keystone. And this is David's Wyrick sketch of that coffin. I'd love to find it. That help you any?
Yeah.
Now this is a Decalogue stone, and you can see on this quite clearly.
Yeah.
This is the original, by the way. This is not a cast. This is where it was glued back together when the handle was broken off. It doesn't show the fact that it is a handle too well, because you have a black space there.
Alrighty.
Okay? And I think the inverse is there. Shows the other. This is a very fine-grained sandstone. I asked my geology friends, what do I want to call this kind of thing? And they said, no, I don't want you to get in trouble, but we geologists would classify it as an alabaster. That does not mean that necessarily it came from the Mediterranean, because there's alabaster all over the world. It's a very, very fine grain of sandstone, very soft. You can carve it very easily. And interestingly enough, this was carved by vertical precision, pushing something sharp down into the stone. And so it's made up of little holes. The Keystone, on the other hand, very clearly is scraped in. So they're not carved the same way, which also makes me feel that David didn't do them both. I was excited about this one. I thought perhaps this one had been faked by the dentist in this story. He drifts in and out as a fakey character. I don't trust Dennis anyway. And I think he is responsible for declaring David the faker. I think he is the one. But you can find that story in my little paper. This is the box in which it was found. Notice how it is carved to hold it, and here's that raised portion on the stone. Now these cracks resulted from the fact that the stone was shipped to New York in the box, and in the shipment process got broken. I'm not sure whether it was on the way to or on the way from New York, but it got broken and was patched. Now one of the things that intrigues me about it, notice these grooves right here that match grooves in the lid of the box. Why? What were those grooves for? Did they perhaps have slivers in them to hold the box together? Also, here are little holes here, but I don't find them up here. And this groove also goes that way. So there's some little inconsistencies in it. Also, down here, perforated out of the box, is about a 1/4 of an inch hole. And I don't know the reason for that. This little bit you see right here, and there's just a touch of it elsewhere. David described this thing as being bronzed. We don't know. Is that what he meant? Treated in some way that had a metallic sheen to it. You can't have this stuff analyzed without destroying it. So we're stuck with guesswork. Oh yes, this is a picture from the mound builders of Denmark. There's the coffin with corpses in it, with an A corpse. This is the inscribed head. It was about the size of a chicken's egg. It was found in a mound on the Wilson farm east of Newark. And this has been translated variously. If you are a Mormon, you translate it, I am a neophyte, because that is a significant term in Mormon beliefs. Others translate that, I'm a newborn, I'm an unfortunate death. It just depends on how you translate it. And I am not an authority in Hebrew. This is how I found it. And see here, an unnatural death, one who degrades himself and falls thereby, a man who falls, and so on and so forth. Remember, these were found after David Wyrick committed suicide. And there was no way that he could have buried them where they were.
All right, we want to thank Dr. Alrutz for his participation in this, the time in his life that he took out. 5 years, intended only one. Being a biologist, that's strange, but I think God directs people. We thank him for that. We thank David Dill as well, that he would have an interest. This interest that let the knowledge become available to us, and then with our knowledge of the Word to come to this point. We also want to appreciate our dear transportation. That is to say, old Panther, that Panther Angel, that the footage you're about to see was taken as we were rolling from Newark Heath Airport. As we rose up over those great mounds, you'll be seeing a view of them, and then at about 230 miles an hour with a nice little help from the tailwind, Panther Angel carried us home. We thank the company that had a great deal in our receiving this plane, and we thank our Father for the tools to do His work. America before Christ, dear ones, letting us know that His Word is true, and that there were teachers that sacrificed far beyond what we're aware of. We thank God for the privilege that together, that we can enjoy these things that were America before Christ. And dear one, you know what? You are there.